All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Tom Lanny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and it's great to see a very full Ream library this afternoon. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of conferences, lectures, special events that relate to questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find our schedule and our events, including in a few days this one, online, so you can tell your friends who couldn't get in to watch it again in a couple days online. Today I'm really happy to join Professor Benny Liu and Professor Carolyn Johnson Hodge and the rest of the Department of Religious Studies who's hosting today's speaker today and tomorrow, Sylvia Chan-Malik. She's going to speak to us today on race, religion, ethnic studies, religious studies in the case of Islam. Dr. Chan-Malik is a scholar of American studies, critical race and ethnic studies, women's and gender studies, and religious studies. Her research focuses on the history of Islam in the United States, specifically the lives of U.S. Muslim women, on Black American Islam, and the rise of anti-Muslim racism in the 20th and 21st century America, and more broadly on the intersections of race, gender, and religion in the struggles for social justice. She's a core faculty member in the departments of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and affiliate guidance faculty for the Department of Religion at Rutgers University-New Brunswick. She's author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color and American Islam, published in 2018, as well as a number of scholarly essays and in academic journals and anthologies. Her writing and commentary have appeared in venues such as the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, Slate, Mike.com, The Intercept, Middle East Eye, PRI, HuffPost, Pathos, Religion News Service, and much more. She's currently working on 2 book projects, A Part of Islam, A Journey Through Muslim America, which offers an essential history of Islam and Muslims in the U.S. for a general audience, and The Soul of Liberation, Race, Religion, and Struggles for Freedom in America, examining the roles of soul and spirit in 20th and 21st century U.S.-based racial liberation movements. Beginning this fall, she'll be a year-long Sawyer Mellon Fellow at Rutgers in a project titled The Afterlives of Liberation, Anti-Racist Praxis for the 21st Century, bringing together scholars, artists, and activists from all over the world to discuss what racial liberation means to them in the 21st century. So please join me in welcoming Sylvia Chan-Malik.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, can I just check, when do we go until? Like 45 minutes, and then do we have time for questions? Okay, that's what I like. So this is my first actual in-person talk since COVID, and I'm a little overwhelmed. It's so wonderful to see you all. It's so wonderful to be in a room where you're not little squares on a screen, and you all look beautiful. And thank you so much for joining me. I'm actually I'm a little bit nervous. There's so many people here. I talk a lot and all the time, but thank you so much for coming. And I hope we have a bit of a discussion today. I hope you will think of comments and questions for me as I speak to you about some of the things I've been thinking about in regards to this topic. So good afternoon to all of you again. And I just want to thank you all, the College of the Holy Cross, for having me here to speak with all of you today, especially Dr. Benny Liu for the invitation and all the wonderful folks that have made this possible. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk about this particular topic in hand. And I don't know, are you all getting extra credit or something like that to be here? I mean, I suspect there's something going on, but I'll just think you all wanted to come see me, but anyways, that's fine. Because I really am concerned about how we should teach race and religion together, and it's something that's concerned me and actually vexed me for many years now. And I'm not sure if it's because I was trained as an interdisciplinary scholar. That may be a word that many of you hear in your classes, interdisciplinarity. And for me, that word is kind of thrown around in the academy. Oh, we do interdisciplinary work. And a lot of times, we don't actually know what we're doing when we do interdisciplinarity. So I want to talk a little bit about what these disciplines are that I'm working in between today. And particularly, in this extremely fraught and polarizing political moment we currently find ourselves in, okay? And so to be an interdisciplinary scholar, one of the things I teach my students, both undergraduates and graduates, is not that we just kind of willy-nilly work in different types of fields, but we actually have to wholeheartedly embrace, engage, and interrogate different fields of study and pay attention to the debates and discourses and ideas that have formed them. And I hope we can all do a little bit of that today. I also deeply welcome any chances that we as colleagues, and I'm talking to the professors and the instructors out here, that we in the social sciences are able to discuss pedagogy, how we teach all these beautiful young folks out here. As I move towards my second decade of teaching, I often reflect on how many of my approaches to teaching have been sort of cobbled together at the moment, like we're scrambling for class and we're trying to figure out, oh, how are we going to get them to talk today? Like, because we hate that. We actually hate that when you don't talk. We sit there and die a little bit inside. But we try. But as I kind of reflect back on my 20 years, I realize there is a through line, a way that I have approached teaching these topics together. How do you explicitly study race and religion together? And I want to talk about that. As a scholar of race, ethnic studies, and I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get everything. As a scholar of race, ethnic studies, Islam and Islam in the United States, I want to start today with the moment that we are in, the political moment. A moment of bans and censorship, of things called critical race theory, of banning drag shows, trans bathrooms, all these types of conversations that we hear. I mean, every single one of you in this room has been privy to these conversations. Until recently at Rutgers, I directed the social justice program. I teach courses on race and ethnicity, Islam in America, feminist methodologies, and though I have never not felt under scrutiny in some way for what I teach and what I study, it is undoubtedly far worse now than it ever was. And I actually find it fascinating that they think this is so scary because I spend most of my classes like teaching writing and like, you know, doing really boring stuff. And I'm like, I'm the most boring person you are, and there is, and you think I'm indoctrinating students. I'm teaching you how to put the comma inside the quotation marks, like, you know. So anyways, looking back on the last decade, most of you may recall, that the first major bans of this particular era were directed at Islam and Muslims. These bans were, in my view, a new phase, a reiteration of what Columbia historian Richard Hofstadter back in 1964 called the paranoid style of American politics. While Hofstadter was writing about the McCarthy era and the Goldwater movement, he traced this particular paranoia across American culture, citing the anti-Masonic, and anti-Catholic sentiments as examples of this type of paranoid style. And he made it clear it was not just limited to one political ideology, not just right, not just left, but in the moment that he's writing in the 60s, it's emerging more from the right. This paranoid style, Hofstadter explained, emerged through the actions of a particular group who have, quote, now demonstrated how much political leverage can be got out of the animosities and passions of a small minority. This small minority, Hofstadter continued, feels, quote, dispossessed. America has been largely taken away from them and their kind, and they are determined to try to repossess it and to prevent the final destructive act of subversion. So you see here, and then he says, the paranoid spokesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. So indeed, we are very much in the grip of this paranoid style today. And it's my contention that how Islam and Muslims have come to be reconfigured and studied in the last 20 years at the intersections of race and religion have arisen in large part as a response to how the paranoid style of American politics, has been deployed in relation to them. As a matter of fact, in the last 20 years, this paranoid style has been both a threat and a boon. So, a positive and a negative for the study of Islam. As I'll discuss in more detail momentarily, interest in Islam and Muslims in a wide range of scholarly fields has mushroomed since 9/11. There are more classes about Islam and Muslims, more departments, more books published than any other time. This interest in Islam has then in turn had a ripple effect across the academy insofar as conversations around Islam and Muslims have inevitably led us to more frequent conversations around race and religion, about how religion is weaponized and in conjunction with race, like how it's operating together, right? How religions are racialized, imbued with racial meanings, etc. So all of this is actually due to how Islam and Muslims have existed in the United States for almost 500 years, and I'll just touch on it for a minute, how Islam has been present in this country for the last 5 centuries in 2 distinctive and highly fraught and contradictory ways. So if you think about it, so the question I often ask students is, what do you know about Muslims? Or what do you know about the history of Muslims in the United States? Because that's the topic I teach specifically. And it's very easy to get students to all get on the same page about the stereotypes, right? Number 2 here as part of the imaginary, in which a hypothetical, oftentimes utterly fantastical Islam and Muslims is crafted as reality. So that's one way that Islam and Muslims have existed. But another way that they have existed is as actual people, actual communities, actual practices, actual cultures. So when you think about the presence and the history of Islam in America, those 2 things are always present at the same time. So, of course, whether we agree or not on the scope of his analysis, Edward Said, students, Edward Said, you know who he is? Hands, yes? So he was a scholar, a Palestinian American. Some, they do. Let me just quick overview. He was a scholar at Columbia, also at Columbia University in the 70s, and he wrote about how the East, the idea of the East, and in particular the idea of the Orient, writing specifically about Islam and Muslims and the Arab world, had been constructed through the lens of European colonialism. So whether or not you agree, he had a very all-encompassing vision of how Orientalists had shaped the disciplines and how we study Islam and Muslims. Whether or not you agree with him completely, it is undeniable that the Western Academy has been shaped by this Orientalist lens, like this way of studying Muslims as objects. Like people will often say, Orientals are rugs, not people. But we talk about Orientals as if they're people, right? And so what's important to note here is that how Orientalism, this previous legacy, this colonial legacy of Orientalism, came to meet this paranoid style of studying Islam after 9/11 has produced the scholarly landscape that we have today. So what I want to suggest and think through with all of you a bit now is how the study of Islam and Muslims in the U.S. Academy, in your classrooms, and also in politics and culture has become bound up with race religion together as one category of analysis, and how we might devise some ways forward to better understand how to teach, discuss, and institutionally situate it going forward. So my broad take on this, this is kind of the quick and dirty, and something I'm taking up in one of my current books, the Soul of Liberation book, is this. This is how I think about the ways in which Orientalism and Islam has been studied kind of in different fields. Orientalist legacies have historically situated the study of Islam and Muslims in area studies departments. So this is area studies, Middle East studies, Near Eastern studies, Asian studies, right? So traditionally, it's been situated in these types of departments, right? Or Islam has been studied in religious studies departments through the study of text. So if you take a religious studies course, they'll say, oh, this is what the Quran says. This is what hadiths say. You're going to study the text, not really the people or the cultures, right? In the post-9/11 era, however, there's been this newfound interest in Islam and Muslims as the subjects and objects of empire. So the ways in which Muslims have been targeted, surveilled, looked at after 9/11. But it's primarily through this lens of state power, like Muslims are victims. Muslims are the targets of securitization. And in some way, this also objectifies and makes Muslims into the same types of objects that the colonial gaze once did. And so what I call this is a type of progressive Orientalism. It's sort of an Orientalism from the left, in which those on the left are also looking at Muslims through a sympathetic lens, but still not looking at them as fully complex and agential people, right? And this winds up more this type of scholarship if you look at studies of Islamophobia and just looking at studies of surveillance against Muslim communities. It winds up being more of a treatment of the ways in which those who are enacting that power, what they are doing, as opposed to who the communities under scrutiny actually are. So for Americanists such as myself, those who study the American landscape and Islam and Muslims in the United States, this is particularly challenging because scholarship on Islam's history in the United States has long been scant, and in the last 20 years has been characterized by this post 9/11 counter-paranoid approach. And as someone who would much prefer to research and teach about one, that's what I'm interested in, I often find myself with a preponderance of scholarship these days about two, right? So I've got Orientalism on the one end and paranoia on the other end, and I'm trying to figure out my way out of it. So to move forward, to think more robustly about the intersections of race and religion, not only in relation to Islam, but more broadly on the future of race, religion, and its study, I want to just give some quick thoughts. And I want to keep it to 45 minutes because I want to talk with you. And it's warm in here, and I know, whatever, it's late, you need coffee, whatever. So I want to just talk a little bit about the histories of these fields, religious studies, Islamic studies, and ethnic studies, and then talk a little bit about a course that I teach at Rutgers. I've taught it at a number of places in addition to Rutgers as well, UC Santa Cruz, Bayonne Claremont Graduate School, which is a theological school, Princeton University, where I was a fellow 2 years ago, and twice I've taught it as sort of a multi-campus digital initiative called DISC, the Digital Islamic Studies Collective, where my course was shared with other Big Ten universities. Finally, just for a moment, I want to turn to how I teach the autobiography of Malcolm X and discuss the ways I've come to think about the book across and relation to the three fields that I discussed today. How many people have read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Anybody? A few, you should read it. Maybe you'll want to read it after this. Okay. So ultimately, my general points are simple and straightforward for today. And they've pretty much stayed the same the whole kind of 3 decades that I've been doing this work. Point one, scholars of religion and Islam should more robustly engage theories, histories, and approaches to the study of race to better understand the sociological and political forces circumscribing their subject matter and field of study. So those of you who study religion, I would urge all of you to think more about the racialized context in which religion takes place, or how people live it, or how people engage others through it. On the other hand, scholars of race and ethnic studies should and must account for religion as a category of analysis, not only to understand how power, resistance, agency, and struggle are formulated and expressed in racialized communities, but also to see how religion operates as a force and structure of American political life. And I have friends in religious studies that say religion is always the elephant in the room, right? We never really mention it, but it's always there. This is not simply false consciousness. It must be reckoned with in order to fully account for the role of race and racism in American society. Finally, we have to ward off these tendencies of paranoia and this constant reaction that we have in relation to the political landscape today. We are in our bodies. We see the world from our perspectives. We know what we know. And I think at the current moment, we're all sort of at a crossroads about how we're supposed to engage one another from these very different, oftentimes, perspectives that we have. And what I encourage all of you, my own students, my own communities to do is that we have to respond to this paranoid style in American politics, not with a paranoid response, but with what philosopher Walter Benjamin once called presence of mind, a way of thinking about and being in time that is at once historical, prophetic, and actively engaged in the fullness of the moment, which is to mean just take a deep breath and kind of understand who you're talking to, who you're engaged with, and how we actually, can be present in that moment. And I would amend Benjamin's words to say that presence of mind also includes our presence in our bodies as we study, engage, and stand in relation to one another in the world. So a disclaimer before I move on to the second little half of the talk, or the second, last little bit. As I reserve the kind of bulk of my critique for ethnic studies, I say that because I'm a latecomer to religious studies. I got my PhD in ethnic studies. I'm trained as a literary and cultural scholar, and religion is something that I figured out I couldn't not deal with. I can't not deal with the field of religious studies when I think about the subjects I think about, right? So I see my work as very firmly situated in race and ethnic studies, cultural and literary studies, media studies, but I understand that these bridges need to be built every step of the way. So I want to tell you a little bit about, quickly, the genesis of the three fields that we are discussing today. And the first is religious studies. Any religious studies majors in here? Some people taking religion courses at the College of the, okay, all right. So religious studies in US universities has gone through three major periods. I get all of these quotes from an article called The History of Religion in American Higher Education by Douglas Jacobson and Rhonda Hudstep Jacobson. And they divide into the three periods. The first being the Protestant period from 1636 to roughly about 1900. And in this period, religion and Protestant are pretty much synonymous, right, within higher education. As the Jacobsons say, the Protestant era in American religion and higher education was a time when all of life, including educations, was wet within a culture of Protestant Christianity. And so much of education in religious studies during this time was meant to train people, right, for religious vocations, and it was for character education. And in many ways, if you were not Protestant, right, if you were Catholic, if you were Jewish, if you were any other faith, this might be considered, they say, oppressive to non-Protestants. The next phase that they talk about begins at the turn of the 20th century, the privatized phase. Right? In the 20th century, religion begins to be seen as private. We start to see these divisions between the secular and the public, right? For the most part, religion was not pushed out of the academy. Instead, the privatization of religion on campuses was often religiously motivated. In fact, the privatization of religion, when viewed from some perspectives, is a religious step forward. More obviously, it opened up space for greater religious inclusivity, right? But actually, what they also point out is that it's interesting, as religion became more privatized, and it was seen as more private, it actually became kind of more ingrained that Christianity was still the norm, because it was like, we're not going to just teach one version, but it's going to be sort of a given, right? And then into the present, what they call the pluriform movement began in the mid-1960s and kind of moves into the present. The religion of contemporary America is pluriform, more complex and multifaceted than it has ever been before. It's not just that religion has become more pluralistic, that more of the world's religions are not presented in the American population, but also that the notion of religion itself has undergone a major restructuring. All right, I'm not going to spend too much time discussing the current landscape, as I want to move into the other fields, right? So Islamic studies, a sort of similar evolution than religious studies. However, Islamic studies has been kind of a slow burn up into 9/11 in terms of how it has been taught and propagated in the American university. At first, for many years, Islamic studies was started in centers. It was focused on the teaching of Arabic and thinking about religious texts, mostly in a historical context. Right? You see here, prior to 9/11, you have a number of centers. I'm not going to read them all out to you. And then in the 1960s, you start to have some programs and departments that emerge. The first in the 1960s at UCLA, then Ohio State. Then in the 90s, you start to see University of Texas and Berkeley develop Near Eastern languages and cultures departments. Since 2001, since 9/11, there have been a number of programs, and even more than what I have here that have emerged, right? So again, thinking about the reasons behind that the way we study religion is really connected to the political landscape and what we see as a priority within what we study. And there's also been a number of endowed chairs that have emerged as well. So the final field I want to talk about is ethnic studies. How many people have heard of ethnic studies, taken a class that they would consider as like an ethnic studies class? Anyone? No? Asian American studies, African American studies, Latino studies, indigenous studies. Okay, yeah, see, you have. You've taken an ethnic studies class. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about why these classes came to be and why these classes are offered here or at whatever places you took them at. So ethnic studies emerged as a field out of the Third World liberation struggles at San Francisco State and the University of California in the late 1960s. This was, you see here, ongoing strikes at both campuses. You see here more images. They were protracted. They lasted, I believe, 4 months at SF State and I believe 5 months at UC Berkeley. And they were violent. There were many clashes between the police. And the main kind of push that the student demonstrators wanted in their struggle for ethnic studies is that they wanted a school. They wanted a college established at these institutions that explicitly centered the lives, perspectives, and knowledge production of historically marginalized communities, and in what they called the Third World Liberation Movement. So this was a moment, 1968 and beyond, in which there were decolonial struggles worldwide, not just in the US, but in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. And the students saw themselves as being caught up in this moment with the people of the world, trying to create a better future for everyone, in which their voices and perspectives were counted and centered and studied as well. All right, so in the wake of the ethnic studies strikes, finally both SF State and Berkeley consented to creating ethnic studies departments. The students did not get all of their demands. That's a whole other story that I'm also writing about, but I don't have time to share it with you now, right? But you see here, the strikes lasted quite some time, and in March 7th, 1969, they established the Ethnic Studies Department at UC Berkeley, and in March 20th, 1969, they established a College of Ethnic Studies at SF State. 30 years later, by 1993, there are hundreds of ethnic studies programs and departments across the US at all levels of education. There's over 40 degree-granting departments and programs and about a dozen PhD programs. And in 2021, and this has been the subject of a lot of debate, and we can talk about this as well, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into legislation making California the first state to require all students to complete a semester-long course in ethnic studies to earn a diploma. So when you take a course in African American studies, when you take a course in Chicano or Native American or Asian American studies, it is really coming out of this ethnic studies tradition that the students fought for in 1968 and 69. Okay, so until about 20 years ago, until about 9/11 though, race, like as the ethnic studies students are looking at, was not a category or subject very often discussed in religious or Islamic studies. So this has changed a bit in the last 20 years. And I've noticed a lot of willingness on the part of religious studies scholars to engage with race and ethnic studies work. There has been a movement. So you see here, I just put 3 central texts. There's many texts that look at race and religion together. But when I first started studying these topics around right after 9/11, there were only a few texts that looked at race and religion together. Here is one, an anthology edited by Craig R. Prentice in 2003 called Religion and the Creation of Race and Ethnicity. And then the next year, there was another anthology from Henry Goldschmidt and Elizabeth McAllister called Race, Nation, and Religion in the Americas. And you see here, almost 15 years later, you have a whole Oxford handbook of race and religion. And when you have an Oxford handbook, that means you've made it, right? That's for the academics. The students probably don't care. But when they want to make an Oxford handbook, that means they're trying to do like field formation. They're trying to make this into something that people study and engage, right? So you see that there has been this engagement, but this has mostly been on the part of scholars who study religion, who've wanted to incorporate race into their analysis. So for example, thinking about the difference between a historically white church and a black church. What are the differences? What are the different expressions, iterations, practices in those types of spaces, right? And so race has become this central mode of analysis through which a lot of religion scholars have started to think about this. However, on the other hand, in the field that I'm most comfortable in, ethnic studies, I've seen a lot less willingness to engage with the religion. And this is because of the historical legacy of what religion is in America. And as religious studies scholar Brent Nongbre says, in the West, not just the United States, but the larger kind of Western, civilization, culture, religion is usually seen as synonymous with Protestant Christianity, right? When you say religion, you think of Christians and Protestants. And so there's this sort of allergy a lot of times in these minoritized fields of study for those who study race and religion to engage religion, because it seems as if it is not a liberational force. It is not something that can be employed to give people power, to empower groups, right? So I want to, as someone who studies Islam, I want to kind of mess this up, right, and kind of think about it in a different way. And so in this time since 9/11, there have been some different programs that have arisen looking at Muslims and Islam from a different lens, not from the religious studies lens, not from the Islamic studies lens. I just wanted to show you a few. This one is one at Michigan State. It's called the Muslim Studies Program, where they think about Muslim people, cultures, expressions. There's a program at the University of Michigan, Arab and Muslim American Studies. And finally, there is a program at San Francisco State, Arab and Muslim Ethnic and Diaspora Studies. Okay, so these are some programs that have come up since 9/11, which look at the ways in which Islam and Muslims are racialized alongside the histories and specificities and cultures of those communities. I'll actually move on here. So Islam in America, this course that I teach. I want to talk a little bit about how I've approached it, how you talk about, a culture, a people that exists mostly in stereotypes for so many of us in the United States. Right, so here's the flyer for the class. I'm not going to read you the whole course description. You can look at it. I can share my slides with you if you want later. But here's the basic question of the course. What is U.S. American Islam, and who are U.S. Muslims? In a political moment when Islam has become a scapegoat and boogeyman for many of the nation's fears and anxieties, this course examines the history of Islam in the United States from the colonial period to the present, with primary considerations of its presence in U.S. culture and politics, the experiences of Muslims in the United States, and Islam's relationships to categories of race, gender, class, and sexuality. So I'm looking at Islam within the political, social, and cultural context in which Muslims have been seen and lived their lives in the United States. Now, this is challenging because there are so many ways to approach it. So some of the ways, I'm actually going to go to this slide and then go back to this one. It's challenging because this is such a vast history that I have to teach. I have to teach the actual history of Islam and Muslims in the United States, at the same time trying to offer students, right, frameworks to understand this history. So Islam in the United States, as you see here, prior to the 1960s, was predominantly a religion that was practiced by African Americans, right? You see early on here, anywhere from 1/3 to 1/5 of enslaved Africans that were brought to this country were thought and sometimes, actually known to be Muslim. You see here famous ones that were documented. This gentleman here, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, whose portrait hangs in the Natural Portrait Gallery, a man named Bilali Muhammad. And then later, right, into the early 20th century, you have a resurgence of Islam in post-emancipation, post-Reconstruction communities in the North with people like Noble Drew Ali, who was in a group called the Moorish Science. So this is all the history. I'm going to do it in 2 minutes here, right? So you're not going to get anything. Don't worry about it. Come take my class someday. Okay? There are Muslim women, African-American women who are converting to Islam in the early 20th century. And then later in the mid-20th century, you have the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, right? You know who Malcolm X is, right? Even though you haven't read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Okay, and so this question students have when they come in is like, okay, these are Muslims, but this is not who we think about when we think about Muslims or when the news talks about Muslims. So how do we reconcile that? Right? So these are the types of things, and then I move on from this, and I say, well, these are also Muslims. This is a community in the 1950s in Los Angeles, California, right? The Islamic Foundation of Southern California. You look at them, right? These are folks in suits. You know, the women's hair is not covered. Their legs are showing on their skirts, right? This is the first non-black, like major Muslim institution, you know, with a large congregation in the United States. Very liberal, progressive, women were on the board, right? And then so you have this, and then you also have in the present moment, you have images. How many of you have seen Miss Marvel? Some of you have seen the new Kamala Khan Miss Marvel show on, no? What is it? My kids have watched it. I don't know about you. And then Ibtihaj Muhammad, an Islamic fencer. She had a Barbie doll, right? And then here you have an image of Muslims praying at the airport during Trump's Muslim ban, in which they were praying at airports as a sign of protest. So how do you connect? I'm actually going to go backwards. How do you connect all of these histories, right, and people and communities together into one history? And that's the challenge. And that's why we have to look holistically at race and religion together and realize that those terms change and evolve at different moments in time. So the ways I try to talk to students and talk them through this history are these particular frameworks. They're epistemology. How do you know what you know about Muslims? How do you know those things? Where'd you learn them from? Why do you believe them? Have you actually talked to people? Who confirmed them for you? The definitions. What are we actually talking about when we talk about Islam and Muslims? Are we talking about Malcolm X? Are we talking about, enslaved African Muslims? Who are we talking about? Approaches. How have different scholars in different fields approached the study of Islam and Muslims? Representations. How are Islam and Muslims represented in politics, culture, media, and knowledge production? And finally, and maybe the most importantly of all, curiosity. What do you want to know about Muslims? What do you think you can't ask, or that you wanted to ask, or that you were frightened to ask, but you want to ask? That's what I ask students to do in our class, and we discuss these things. Okay, so let me go back forward again, so you can look at all the images again, and close with some ideas about how to talk about and think about Malcolm X. Okay? And so the first question I also ask to students is, how do you know what you know about Malcolm X? And most students will say, and nod if this is true, they say, we learned that he was the opposite of Martin Luther King. Anybody learn that? Yes? A little bit? We learned that Martin Luther King was peaceful and good, and he wanted to make America better, and Malcolm X was violent and bad, and he was angry, and he wanted to separate from white people. Yes? I'm not saying you believe that. I'm just saying, did you learn that, right? So a lot of students will say that, right? And so when I walk into that classroom, I'm aware of that. So I have to confront, right, that understanding that my students have about not just perhaps the most famous Muslim American they know, but perhaps in some cases, people will say Malcolm X as well as Muhammad Ali are the most famous Muslims people around the whole world know, right? And so how do I teach Malcolm X to people who are thinking already in certain ways about who he is? Well, I think about it as a Bildungsroman. That's a term that means it's a novel dealing with one's person's formative years or spiritual education. It's a story of his development, his growth. He goes through many phases in his life as an African-American man, as a gangster, as someone who's in prison, as someone who becomes a minister in the Nation of Islam, and finally as Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, and transitions into a more expansive understanding of Islam. I teach it as a history of Islam in America. Malcolm X really goes through those different phases that I just showed you in those slides about the different ways in which Islam has existed in the United States. I talk about him as a type of Black liberation theologian, thinking about engaging theology as a way to get free. I think about him as a Black American Muslim in the world, how he impacted world politics and the impact of Black Muslim thought in the world. And finally, through his own processes of gender formation, racial formation, and spiritual formation, and always in a relationship between who he is as a Black man, a Black Muslim man in the United States, and his engagement with the global religion of Islam, the Ummah, the internationalist scope of Islam. So always thinking about that relationship, right? And so I want to end today because I want to talk to you and I want to hear your feedback. I want to end with this quote, and kind of, it's a thorny quote, and there's a lot of difficult quotes in the autobiography of Malcolm X, which maybe these days would get banned in a lot of classrooms in America. And he has this quote towards the very end, and this is after he goes on his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca. And he comes back, and people oftentimes say, well, Malcolm X, when he came back, he kind of threw away all the Black nationalism. He wasn't into that. He was into a more internationalist version of Islam. But that's not actually true. He still very much held fast to the notion of Black liberation that was to be led by Black people worldwide. So he has this quote where he's kind of ruminating on the role of religion in relation to racial justice movements. And he says, the only true world solution today is governments guided by true religion of the spirit. Here in race-torn America, I am convinced that the Islam religion is desperately needed, particularly by the American Black man. The Black man needs to reflect that he has been America's most fervent Christian, and where has it gotten him? In fact, in the white man's hands, in the white man's interpretation, where has Christianity brought this world? And I show it next to this image of him as he's learning how to pray. And so Malcolm X's evolution as a Muslim is also very interesting. It's only towards the end of his life in 1963, 1964, that he starts to engage with quote-unquote orthodox expressions of Muslim ritual, like praying on the prayer mat with the prostrations, right? He does not do this when he's in the Nation of Islam. And he's facing the camera, sort of looking at us or oriented towards us as he's praying. And I think of this quote in terms of the relationships that Malcolm wanted to articulate between himself and the world. Him standing there on the prayer mat as a Muslim, looking out at the United States and its historical legacies of race and religion. He is asking people to reflect, to consider where they stand in relation to the world. Unfortunately, Malcolm would not live to see the emergence of Black liberation theology or engage with the movements of Latin American liberation theologians, nor would he witness the horrors of 9/11 perpetrated in the name of Islam. And this is how I teach Malcolm X in terms of these relationships, that this is not so much just an indictment of Christianity and he's saying, oh, it's not that black and white. It's about in that moment where he's standing, he's looking out at the world and trying to think through who he is in his own body and how he's seeing the landscape around him and how to analyze and think through how to move through it. So in closing, I want to show you another image that I came across right as I was finishing my first book, which is about the history of Muslim women in the United States. And in that book, I introduce a term called affective insurgency, in which I talk about the ways Muslim women move through the world, and in particularly those who are recognizably Muslim, in which they feel the ways that people are looking at them and engaging them at every moment. And I found this image after I finished, and I thought it really beautifully captured what I meant. And you see here, it's a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, and in front of her, she's got all these speech bubbles, right? And it says things like, if you look at the speech bubbles, it says things like, oh, it's un-American. God doesn't really care what you wear. It makes me sick. You're betraying your family. You're betraying every American serviceman who died in the War on Terror. Your husband is controlling. Your hair isn't special. So you can read them all yourself. And what this illustrates is the way in which, before this woman even enters the room, she knows that all these ideas exist in the air. And I think all of you have experienced that to some degree, right? You're going to a party, you're like, oh gosh, so-and-so thinks this about me, whatever. You're like, people are talking about me. And what do you feel in your body? You feel anxious, you feel terrified, you feel, angry, you feel frustrated, right? This is a state of constant being for this Muslim woman here. Everywhere she's going in the world, she's navigating this, right? And so just as Malcolm X assessed the world and was looking at it in that way and coming to certain interpretations, you also have new types of subjectivities and people with, different identities who are moving through the world in this way in which race, religion, gender, sexuality, class, and power are always in the air. And so indeed, if I would try to, if I could draw, which I can't at all, I would draw actually another dimension of this image, in which the ways in which this young woman's faith, her principles, her ethics, her beliefs, and what she's guided by sort of also hover around her. And the relationship between those things, her ethics, her values, her faith practices, her beliefs, engage with these ideologies that move in the air in front of her, right? And that's how I try to approach the teaching of race and religion to my students, to my peers, and my own work. Because I want to demonstrate that they must assess where they stand, so for all of you to assess where you stand, and understand how you know what you know about race, about religion, about gender, about class, about power, about all of these really fraught categories that we have to deal with and navigate every day, so that you can better navigate the political, cultural, and social structures that you move through every single day. Thank you very much. Oh, I forgot. I wanted to show you just really quick because I'm so proud of them. These were some, projects that my students did last semester at the end where they were kind of trying to model this. I do these final projects where they can do whatever they want. This is my Islam in America class. One of my students, who was a wonderful artist, I should have asked her to help me with this bubble thing. She drew these images of Muslims having to pray in public spaces. This is a young woman doing her prayer in the library amidst all this information. I had another student who did kind of a family history, a collage of her Egyptian-American family, and another student who looked at the impact of the Sudanese people on Malcolm X. I mean, it's amazing when you give students kind of the freedom to stand where they are and look at the topic and engage it, the creativity and the kind of wonder of what they come up with. So again, I was just proud of them, so I wanted to show that. So anyways, I would love to hear your questions, comments, concerns, anything. I know I was all over the place, so just bring it. Come on, ask whatever you want. If you got it, you.
I'll maybe ask you, there's a microphone in the middle, and I know everyone will say, I can be heard from here, but because we're being recorded for online, if you would ask your questions at the mic, that would help. With some brave soul.
Like I said, we die a little inside when you're quiet. I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. We're also very used to it. So, and can I sit on this? Am I going to fall? Okay, no, I'm going to sit here. Hi.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I'm an anthropologist. I'm Carmen Herring. I teach here at Holy Cross. I'm very aware of how Muslims were racialized after 9/11, and what I mean by racialized is they were stereotyped as potential terrorists, as sort of the enemy within, and there was all these ways in which they began to be racially profiled in very intense ways whenever they tried to enter the country, right? So I'm aware of that history because I saw it happen.
Right.
But I love that you're bringing us further back in time. Can you say more about how Muslims have been racialized pre-9/11? Particularly given sort of the big role that Muslims had in the civil rights movement? And
Yeah, absolutely.
How has the FBI, for example?
So I'll just give you thank you for that wonderful question. There's just a few examples that I'll bring up. So many of you may know that Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. Some newly elected representatives to the House and to the Senate have been sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, right? And while the founding fathers actually had robust discussions and ways of talking about Muslims, there's actually a debate in the Constitutional Convention, I believe, I can't remember what year right now, about whether a Muslim could actually be president. Right? So these are conversations that happened amongst the founding fathers. But while they were having these conversations, right, even though they were talking so deeply and politically and theoretically about Muslims, that's exactly what it was, theoretical. They had no understanding that 1/5 of the enslaved peoples, and many of them were enslavers, right, had Muslims in their own midst. They would talk about Muslims as hypothetical, like, oh, but a Muslim could be president, but we'll never really have Muslims here. And there was already thousands of Muslims in the country at that time. But because they were black, they were not seen as people that had these religious lives. So that's one way. So thinking about racialization, their erasure, the inability to see African Americans, enslaved peoples, as people with agency to choose and practice their religion. Another way that I often draw parallels between is that African American Muslims in the Nation of Islam, such as Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, had very robust CIA and FBI files through a program that some of you may have heard of called COINTELPRO. And many of the practices, COINTELPRO, you've heard of it, counterintelligence program, right? And many of the practices of COINTELPRO, and some scholars are doing this work more, and it has to be done more robustly, but a lot of the practices of COINTELPRO were the ones that directly shaped the war on terror policies, or many of them were already in place in ways that directly kind of led to the war on terror, having the existing infrastructure that it already did to, become something. The Department of Homeland Security is only 20 years old. I mean, it feels like we've had TSA forever, but it's only been 20 years. I grew up not having to take my shoes off at the airport. I mean, you guys don't know that. A lot of you don't know that, but it's only 20 years old. It was a post-9/11 construction. And so COINTELPRO, in a lot of times, direct relationship to the fears that they had around domestic terrorism as fomented by African American Muslims, was kind of a direct predecessor to the war on terror. And so you can see the similarities when you start to look at the language there about how they use that as a template. So that's another way. And the final way that I point out is that when we think about, so the three Abrahamic faiths, the three major Abrahamic faiths are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, right? All three faiths share a lot of the same stories, a lot of the same, like imagery. People are often surprised when they read the Quran, how much of the Bible, so much is so similar, right? But when we think about who Muslims are in relation to who practices Judaism and Christianity, Muslims are the group that in the Western imaginary is always coded as non-white. In some way. They're always seen as brown or black and foreign, right? Though they all come kind of from the same Abrahamic root. So, those are just kind of a few that I can think of off the top of my head, and there's so many more. And they're also gendered, the ways in which they're racialized. Muslim men are racialized in different ways than Muslim women, and so there's also that entire aspect, and that's a whole other talk. Right, but thank you for your question. Any other questions? Ask anything. Curiosity. What did you want to know that you never knew, or that you wanted to know? I'm here. I'm nice. Or I try to be.
You mentioned critical race theory,
Yep.
And I was wondering. My understanding is that it's a pretty high-level graduate course for the most part. How would you balance teaching someone young when they are first shaping how they view the world versus something as complex as CRT and the level of intelligence you need to have? How would you balance how you would teach that, at what level, maybe?
Well, I would never, first of all, as someone who, never really even encountered the study of race until college, I shouldn't say that. We all study it in some ways. I remember being in 7th grade and learning about Japanese internment camps and being just completely horrified that this history took place, and I was just learning about it now. I mean, it was 7th grade, it wasn't that early. But you know, my teacher at that time was very honest and a really wonderful teacher who allowed me to explore it and showed me kind of the injustices. And some might say these days that that's a type of critical race theory because they were showing the injustices. See, that's the thing. Critical race theory, like I said, I'm a boring academic. And critical race theory is some of the most boring stuff that you'll ever read. Sorry, don't tell my friends who do it. It's legal theory. It is a very rarefied kind of form of discourse. When I teach anything in which the actual person who wrote the text considers themselves a critical race theorist. So for example, I teach a text in my Islam in America class by an author named Letty Volpe. She's a law professor at UC Berkeley. She has this essay called The Citizen and the Terrorist, and she looks at court cases since 9/11 to look at the ways in which Muslim citizenship has been constituted in relation to terror. Actual court cases, really boring. The students are like, this is really hard to read, Professor Chan-Malik, how do I read this? So I actually have to talk them through it, and this is a college class. So there's absolutely no way I would teach that to any student. Even for, graduate students, you have to talk them through that in a certain way, right? So I think when we talk about it, I mean, you all hear this, it's become a sort of dog whistle phrase for a host of other things that it actually is not. And I understand that. I mean, I understand the way politics works. I'm not naive. But yeah, I mean, beyond that sort of high-level college engagement where you actually need a professor or someone to help you through it, I wouldn't teach those essays to many people, and not even outside the context of those classes, because they've come into classes wanting to know, how have Muslims been racialized in the law, in politics, in culture? And so we look at all of those different things, and that's how I think about that in my classes. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Great question. Anyone else? Oh, thank you for getting up.
Literally getting up.
Very agile.
Thank you. My name is Vicki Langor. I'm trained as a Middle East scholar in political science, and for the last several years have been teaching a year-long seminar in Montserrat in our first-year program,
Oh, wow.
which focuses in the first semester mostly on the experiences of Muslims in the United States, and then takes it abroad to U.S. foreign policy in Muslim-majority countries. So what I wanted to ask you about is if you, in your class, or just more generally in your upcoming book, deal with the relationships between and the tensions sometimes between the two major components of the American Muslim population. So on the one hand, African American Muslims, and in the last 30 years, a much larger growing, much growing, immigrant American, or Arab American, Asian American, et cetera, Muslims. So for example, in my class, one of the students did a presentation on the fact that when George Floyd was killed, right, it was a Palestinian American-owned little shop, Cup Foods, that made that call about the hypothetical or the potential fraudulent bill that was being put in, right, and used that as a platform to talk about pre-existing and since much bigger movements in the Muslim American community to educate often Arab American and other immigrant Muslim American shopkeepers about Black being, what it meant to be in historically Black communities, and some of the tensions between those relationships. Similarly, I'm also thinking pop culture-wise. Have you watched Rami?
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Right.
So we've watched excerpts from Rami, which is a show by an Egyptian-American comedian, three seasons, and we watched some in that class, some of the stuff about what it was like for him in New Jersey as a middle schooler to experience 9/11, right? Yeah. But then, as you know, in the second season and beyond, he, as an Egyptian-American, in an Egyptian-American family in New Jersey, marries an African-American. And then some of the tensions and some of the racism and ethnic problems on both sides, both among the African-American Muslims, what they think of these Egyptian Muslims, and vice versa. So I was just curious how you approach those kind of relationships.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. So just kind of broad snapshot. That's a great question. I'm so happy you asked that. Broadly speaking, the U.S. population is about 2% of the overall population. So I always just like to point out, like, how much we talk about Muslims in proportion to how many Muslims there actually are is like, woo, like this, right? But within that 2% Muslim population, right, it's a growing population. It's the fastest growing religion in the United States. I think by 2050, it's supposed to be, as far as projections go, the second largest religious group in this country, right? So because of that, you have incredible diversity. Because Muslims, and again, this goes back to kind of the way I look at it as a relationship and thinking about race and religion are at different moments of time, is because who Muslims are at different moments in time and what Islam is understood as and how it's been practiced and lived has been very different at different moments in time. And in 2023, post 9/11, right, you see this kind of overlapping and engagement between these different iterations of Islam. African Americans who converted in the 1940s and 50s who are now 3 generations, 4 generations in. Or you have very recently arrived Syrian refugees, or you have a Somali community in Lewiston, Maine, or you have, Afghani community in Oklahoma, right, who have very different understandings and perspectives of what their religion is. Because anybody here who practices a religion knows that you don't just all practice the same thing, even though you share a religion with someone, right? It depends on your family, where you're from, your congregation, your teachers, your Sunday school teacher, like what did they teach? All these things matter, right? And so for all these different Muslims, right, we're seeing a moment, and I always say this, okay, this is my little story, and this is in my new book, I tell this story. The day before 9/11, there were 5 mosques in the neighborhood where I kind of grew up in Oakland, California. There was an African-American mosque, a Shia mosque, a group called the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam that had a mosque, a largely Pakistani mosque, and a largely Arab mosque. And prior to 9/11, they didn't really talk, right? They all just kind of did their own thing. They were just kind of their own communities. And you could kind of walk. I mean, it's like a 10-mile radius. I guess you would mostly drive. But what happened after 9/11? What happened after 9/11 was people said, who are the Muslims? Who speaks for you? Who's going to come out and tell us who you are and what you do and what you believe in? And everybody was kind of like, I can tell you what I do, or I can tell you what I do. Right? Or some people stepped up and wanted to be that spokesman. And it was because of that political moment. It was because of that moment that they were put under the spotlight, that all these disparate groups suddenly had to articulate what it meant to be an American Muslim. And they all had very different versions of it. And in regards to the immigrant versus African American, I don't like to set up that strict dichotomy because people are generations in, or refugees are different than voluntary immigrants and all these types of things. But if you think about an African-American Muslim, like a Malcolm X, or someone who converts to Islam, leaving the Christian church, they are choosing Islam for religious and spiritual reasons, but also in many cases for reasons that are deeply tied to the political landscape. They don't want to go to a church that they feel has a white supremacist sort of ideology. They don't want to live in a community where the church is related to a particular type of racial ideology. So they become Muslim as a type of liberation practice. So for African Americans, becoming Muslim is often related to that liberation practice. And they have a critique of America and American racial politics that is deep and profound. An immigrant, I'm the child of immigrants, an immigrant on the other hand, what do you think when you go to a new place, when you come to America? I mean, whether we believe in it or not, I think you want the American dream. You want to come, you could practice your religion freely here. I can be whoever I want to be. I can be Muslim and American. I can wear an American flag hijab, right? And you have a very positive, or you want to have a very positive understanding and relationship of America, with America, right? And so for these two groups within the Muslim American community, it's a strong tension that is just now in the last 20 years being grappled with and talked about within that community. How do you deal with these two different understandings and visions of America within one community? I think 9/11 has, kind of brought some solidarity amongst these groups because, you see the war on terror, you see the type of surveillance practices that happen, and people have come to start to have harder conversations on what it means and trying to figure out what their shared concerns are. But, it's an ongoing conversation. I'm watching it and kind of engaging with it in my own community and different communities with students all the time, and it's really fascinating to watch it unfold. Yeah. Any more? You can email me if you forgot your question or if you were shy. My email's on the internet. You can Google me. But, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for coming and staying in this warm room. It was lovely to talk to you all. Thank you. Good first talk after COVID. Good first non-Zoom in-person talk.